this morning's reading is, well, it's going to be under 3 minutes, and it's going to be in the form of a dialogue between Woody Allen and Richard Dawkins. You might find that an unusual combination, but see what you think. So first, Woody Allen. I'm taking the big picture here, that eventually you die, and eventually the sun burns out, and the earth is gone. And eventually all the stars, all the planets, the entire universe goes, disappears, nothing is left at all. No Shakespeare, no Beethoven, Michelangelo, all gone. And you think to yourself, it's a lot of noise and sound and fury, and where is it going? It's going nowhere. And then every 100 years, somebody presses a button and a big toilet flushes, and everybody on earth changes. Everybody, all the Muslims are gone, all the Afghanistanis, all the Americans, everybody on the planet is gone, and a new set comes in, full of worry and anxious, and they're doing everything. And then they're all gone. Every 100 years, it's like the whole planet gets washed clean with everybody on it. All these people that are making your life miserable, your next door neighbor, the people that are robbing you on the street, they're all gone. The president, yes, the president, and the bank robber, all out. So it just seems like a big meaningless thing. Now you can't actually live your life like that, because if you do, you just sit there, and why do anything? Why get up in the morning? So I think it's the job of the artist to try and figure out why, given this terrible fact, why we should want to go on living. Why do you care about anything at all if this terrible truth is there, a meaningless end of everything? It's Woody Allen. Here's Richard Dawkins, as if to reply to what Woody Allen just said. We are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. Most people are never going to die because they are never going to be born. The potential people who could have been here outnumber the grains of sand of Arabia. These people include poets greater than Keats and scientists greater than Newton. In the teeth of stupefying odds, it is you and I, in our ordinariness, that are here. We won the lottery against all odds. How dare we whine at our return to a state from which the vast majority have never had a chance of emerging? That's it.
It is my pleasure to be the MC today to introduce an all-time favorite of HGP. Jeff Seward joins us for the 15th time to analyze the 2020 election and try and shed some light on the craziness that has come to define America. Jeff has a Ph.D. from Stanford in politics and government, a master's from the University of Washington, and a Bachelor of Arts from UT Austin. He has been a professor at Pacific University since 1990. He fascinates students with a wide range of courses, as illustrated by his current offerings, national systems and global challenges, and socialism and its critics. Prior to teaching, Jeff was a political reporter and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. His presentations have been known to make us laugh, cry, and contemplate leaving the country, all in the span of an hour and 15 minutes. So
today's reading reminded me of, there's a scene in one of Woody Allen's films, I can't remember which one, in which the Woody Allen character as a little boy is refusing to do his homework. And his mother says, "What's the problem?" He says, "Well, we learned in school today that in 3 billion years, the sun's going to explode and we're all going to die. So what's the point?" I'd like to start my presentation today with a cartoon. This is the cartoon, Trump talking to the GOP elephant, looking at the horizon. And Trump is saying, "The sun is not setting on me. Those cheating Democrats are raising the horizon." That's sort of where we are. We are witnessing the most unprecedented political phenomenon in American history. The Democratic Party has stolen a presidential election by piling up almost 6 million illegal votes for Joe Biden. Especially impressive was his theft of the popular vote in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, almost certainly accomplished by letting illegal aliens vote. not Mexicans like the millions of illegal votes Hillary Clinton got in California in 2016, but probably illegal Canadian voters infiltrating our northern border. What's so phenomenal and puzzling about this massive fraud is that the Democrats were so incompetent that they forgot to steal the United States Senate while they were at it. They stole enough votes in Georgia to give Biden a 14,000 vote margin, but they forgot to tell their operatives to steal votes for their two Democratic Senate candidates who both polled fewer votes than their Republican opponents. They stole enough votes for Joe Biden in Maine that he won by over 70,000 votes, and they rigged all the pre-election suppression polls to show their candidate winning the United States Senate seat in Maine, but they forgot to actually steal any votes for Sarah Gideon, the Democratic candidate for the Senate, and so the Republican, Susan Collins, won re-election by over 70,000 votes. They spent over $100 million supporting Jamie Harrison to try to defeat Lindsey Graham, but somehow they forgot to use all that money to steal any actual votes in South Carolina, and Graham won re-election by 258,000 votes. And they stole the election for Joe Biden for president, but forgot to steal votes for the House of Representatives, so not a single Republican incumbent was defeated, and the Democrats lost at least 10 seats in the House, maybe more. And they didn't steal enough votes to flip a single state legislature, which means the Republicans will dominate redistricting for the next 10 years in many key American states. Talk about the gang that couldn't shoot straight. I mean, for the love of God, where was Mayor Daley when we needed him? When Mayor Daley manufactured votes in Chicago for John F. Kennedy in 1960, he damn well made sure that all those suspicious ballots also voted for Democrats up and down the ballot. If I were a defeated Democratic candidate for the Senate or the House or a state legislature, I would have some pretty tough questions for Mr. Biden about why he was so selfish in perpetrating his fraud. It reminds me of the scene in The Godfather when the heads of all the mob families are complaining that Don Corleone has all the judges in New York in his pocket, but is refusing to share them. Why was Joe Biden so selfish that he wouldn't share any of his stolen votes with his fellow Democrats? And of course, the answer to my question is that Joe Biden didn't have any fraudulent votes to share with fellow Democrats. Millions of Republican-leaning voters were sick to death of Donald J. Trump and voted for Joe Biden at the same time that they stuck with their Republican leanings to vote for Susan Collins in Maine and Doug Perdue and Kelly Loeffler in Georgia and Republican state legislators across the country. The Trump narrative of a stolen election is, of course, the real fraud. It is a preposterous fraud, but also a deeply dangerous fraud because it is being echoed by conservative TV and radio media, much of social media, and by most Republican office holders, and threatens to undermine not just the legitimacy of this election, but of future elections as well. 80% of the public, including half of Republicans, believe that Joe Biden won the election, and only 3% believe that Trump won. However, 79% of Republicans, even though they recognize that Biden won, don't believe this was a fair and free election. 79% of Republicans don't believe this was a free and fair election. They are already questioning the legitimacy of a Joe Biden presidency and buying into a narrative that the election was stolen. Pretty soon, we'll be hearing rumors that Joe Biden was actually born in Ireland and is therefore ineligible to be president and is probably a Sinn Féin terrorist leader to boot. This is not a matter of incompetence or ignorance or delusion on the part of Trump or his supporters. This is a very conscious strategy of mobilizing completely cynical and authoritarian media to delegitimize Joe Biden and delegitimize our democratic elections, to set up some future situation where Republicans can thwart the democratic will of the people and actually steal a future election. This is a stab in the back narrative, similar to Hitler's claim that Germany was winning World War I until it was betrayed by Jews and Marxists on the home front. That stolen election narrative will give hardcore supporters the conviction that it is legitimate to use any and all means to beat the Democrats because the Democrats used any and all means to steal this election. That means more voter suppression, not less, even more aggressive gerrymandering at the state level and for congressional seats, voter intimidation, laws against mail-in voting, I think we'll see, laws making registration and voting harder, etc. It also makes it difficult, this stolen election meme, it makes it much more difficult for Republican members of Congress to go rogue and support any policy initiatives of a Biden administration. And this myth of the stolen election, it's working. Roger Stone and Steve Bannon are behind a massive Stop the Steal campaign. And as I said, people are believing this. Look at this number, 86%. That's the percentage of Trump supporters that do not believe Biden legitimately won the election. That's according to a poll by The Economist and YouGov. And a similar percentage, around 80%, said Trump should not concede the election, but should keep on trying to overturn it. And with the Republican Party strongly backing Trump on this, or at least remaining embarrassingly silent, we have a sort of half democracy in America. One of the two major parties has gone full-fledged authoritarian with no respect for democratic processes or democratic norms. And we have an electoral system heavily tilted towards sustaining the political power of this anti-democratic minority party and minority electorate. Democrats have won the popular vote now in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, going back to 1992. And yet the Supreme Court has 6 members appointed by Republican presidents and only 3 appointed by Democratic presidents. The Democrats routinely win more votes for the Senate and represent a clear majority of the population in the Senate, and yet have to suffer with Republican control of the Senate. Democrats routinely win many more votes for the House of Representatives, and they did again this cycle, yet lost 10 to 12 seats and are in danger of losing control of the House in 2022. The average in off-year elections is that the party that doesn't control the White House typically gains 27 seats in off-year elections. If that happens in 2022, control of the House will return to the Republicans. And of course, there is the Electoral College. I wanted to show you something about the Electoral College that gives you a sense of just how much it distorts the vote in America. What I have here is a comparison between the electoral votes of California and the electoral votes of the 16 smallest red states. Because the Electoral College gives a state the number of votes that it is the sum of its representatives plus its senators, these 16 small red states have 32 senators. California only has 2 senators, right? So if you add up these 16 small red states. They have a population just under 40 million, essentially the same as California. California gets 55 electoral votes. Those 16 small red states get 85 electoral votes for the same population. So there's a swing of 30 electoral votes that go to small red states simply because of the way the Electoral College is set up. There are other ways to look at the distortions of the Electoral College, but that's an important one. This disproportion has grown over time because the smaller states are smaller relative to the big states. And so this gets worse every election cycle. Why did Biden win? Well, first of all, he didn't win by much. A swing of less than 50,000 votes or so in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, and Biden drops from 306 electoral votes to 269 electoral votes, and we have a tie. That's a smaller set of narrow victories than Trump had in winning Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania in 2016. That was about 75 or 80,000 votes margin that he had. Biden had a smaller margin than that in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona. One factor that hasn't been much noted is the volume of votes cast for Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian candidate. Let me show you that. Here are the votes for Joe Jorgensen, who I'd say is the Jill Stein of 2020. Jill Stein, of course, was the Green Party candidate in 2020, and she got more votes than Trump's margin of victory in Wisconsin, Michigan, and I think maybe Pennsylvania. Well, Joe Jorgensen did that to Trump this time. In Pennsylvania, she got 78,000 votes. Biden's victory margin was 63,000. In Wisconsin, Jorgensen got 38,000. Biden's margin was a little over 20,000. In Georgia, she got, I guess it's a she got 62,000 votes. Biden's margin was only 14,000. In Arizona, she got 51,000. Biden's margin was only 11,000. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that if the Libertarian Party didn't have a candidate, that all those votes would go to Trump. A lot of libertarians may be very hostile to Trump. Some of them might have actually voted for Joe Biden. Maybe many of them wouldn't have voted at all if they hadn't had a libertarian candidate. The same was probably true of Jill Stein in 2016, or maybe even Ralph Nader in 2000. You don't know for sure where those votes would have gone, but if Democrats are going to be mad at the Green Party for what they've done, the Republicans have some justification for being mad at the Libertarians. So Biden didn't win by much, even though he's going to end up with about 6 million more popular votes than Trump did. That's more than twice as many as Hillary Clinton won by. And yet with just a switch of 50,000 votes in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, he would not be the president-elect. That gives you, so that's one reason that Biden won. Second, hooray for the coronavirus. The coronavirus has saved our democracy. Without Trump's bungling of the coronavirus crisis, it is hard to see how Biden would have won. I think Trump would have won by an electoral college landslide if he had done just a reasonably good job of managing the coronavirus crisis. And we could be then facing an even deeper democratic crisis than we are, with Trump ready to serve a second four-year term. How badly has Trump bungled the coronavirus response? Just look at data comparing our deaths to what other countries would be experiencing if they had the same population as the United States. So I took the number of deaths in a country and I multiplied it by the size of the US population relative to the country's population. So if this country had had the same population as the United States, how many deaths would they have had? The United States, this is a week old or so, we're up to like 246,000 or something now. We've had 237,000. If Canada were as big as us, they would have had 92,000 deaths. Germany, only 43,000. Norway, less than 17,000. Australia, less than 12,000. Remember, this is assuming that their populations are blown up to the size of the United States. Uruguay, my favorite, would have only 6,000 deaths. Japan, 4,400. South Korea, 2,800. New Zealand, only 1,600 deaths compared to 237,000. China, only 1,150 deaths, although their numbers are always suspect. And Taiwan, if it were as big as the United States, would have only 105 deaths. Their actual number is like 15 deaths so far. This is a measure of how completely bungled Trump's response to the coronavirus was. And I think that made a difference. A lot of voters said the coronavirus was their most important issue. But look at this. Even so, 18% of the population, of the voting population, said we were doing very well in our response to the coronavirus. And another 33% said we were doing somewhat well. So a majority of the electorate thought we were doing a pretty good job on coronavirus, which shows you how powerful a systematic and repeated lie coming out of the President of the United States is. Now, among those who thought we were doing badly, Joe Biden racked up tremendous majorities. He got 94% of the vote of those who thought we were doing very badly. And so his vote totals among people who thought they were doing very badly were greater than those who voted for Donald Trump. But without if the coronavirus had actually been done well, I think Joe Biden would have gotten swamped because people who thought we were doing well on the coronavirus voted for Trump by over 80%. And finally, something that explains Joe Biden's victory is that apparently a lot of Republican-leaning voters were just hostile to Trump, even though they still voted Republican for other offices. So look at Maine again. Biden won the state by 70,000 votes, about a 9% margin. That's very, very comfortable. That's normally considered a landslide. While at the same time, Susan Collins, the Republican incumbent senator, won re-election by about the same margin, 70,000 votes. So Biden got about 140,000 more votes in Maine than the Democratic Senate candidate, Sarah Gideon, who was a strong candidate, Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, but a lot of Republicans, Republican-leaning voters, voted for Joe Biden and Susan Collins in Maine. That's probably the most extreme examples, but similar things happened elsewhere, in Georgia, for example. Why did Trump and the Republicans outside of the presidential race do so well? Well, to repeat the old phrase of James Carville from 1992, it's the economy, stupid. The Obama economy in the last 3 years was better than the first 3 years of the Trump economy before the pandemic. In fact, the Democrats have had better economic performance than the Republicans on the stock market, employment, and GDP growth ever since the end of 1945. The public, however, believes the opposite. Polls consistently show that they think Republicans will do a better job on the economy. I don't know why the Democrats don't make this a main theme of their election propaganda every year. Every administration since 1945, the Democrats have performed better than the Republicans on every measure of the economy. But for some reason, Democrats are silent on that and almost concede to the Republicans the notion that somehow they're going to be better for the economy. But let me show you again some more data here from exit polls. So in the last 3 years of the Obama administration, the average number of jobs created was 227,000. During the first 3 years of the Trump administration, before the coronavirus, they were only adding 191,000 jobs. So job creation was lower in the Trump administration, despite the huge tax cut that was supposed to goose the economy, than it was during the Obama years. Here's the unemployment rate. It spiked in 2010 as a result of the horrible economic crisis left over from the Bush administration. From there, it steadily fell. And it continued to fall during the Trump administration, but essentially in the same way that it had been falling in the Obama administration. So there was no miracle employment drive under the Trump economy at all. There was simply a continuation of the trend from Obama. And in fact, the trend flattened out somewhat because Trump was creating fewer jobs per month than Obama had. And here's real median household income. It's gone up during those first 3 years of the Trump administration, but it was already going up. From this low, it had been going steadily up, was going up slightly faster in the last year or so of Obama, and then the Trump years. So there's just no truth whatsoever to the myth that somehow Trump had this marvelous economy that was radically better than the economic disaster of the Obama years. But it's believed by the electorate. And let me show you this. This is what was the most important issue for your vote. And look at the economy. For those people who thought the economy was the most important issue, 83% voted for Trump. That's extraordinary. And I think this was an important factor in why Trump did so well. Fundamentally, many Americans agreed with Trump that the cure shouldn't be worse than the disease, and believed that the Democrats wanted to shut down the economy and Trump wanted to keep it open, ignoring the fact that the failure to deal effectively with the coronavirus is precisely what is hammering the economy. But Trump won that battle of public discourse and convinced people that the Democrats would shut down the economy again, and he would not, and that was more important than the suffering from the coronavirus. And this was especially true because, as I pointed out, a majority of the electorate thought we were doing pretty well on the coronavirus. So it couldn't be Trump's bungling of the coronavirus that was causing our economic problems, because he was doing a pretty good job, according to 51% of the electorate. Now, Biden did make inroads with women and suburban voters, although not as much as pre-election polls were showing. He won women by 12%, according to exit polls, but some polls before the election had him winning women by more than 20%. One even said he was going to win women by 27%. The advantage that he did get with women and the suburbs was partially offset by inroads that Trump made with minority voters, especially Black and Latino men. I want to show you some data that I found really quite stunning. Here is the vote by gender and race. Notice that Trump carried white men 61 to 38. But look at the figure for Black men and even Black women, that Biden carried Black women by 90%, Black men by only 79%. Almost 20% of Black men voted for Trump. 36% of Latino men voted for Trump. despite his open and blatant racism towards Blacks and Latinos. Together, Black women, Biden only won something like 87, 88% of the Black vote. Democrats usually win 92, 93% of the Black vote. Why was that? This is a very worrisome trend. For Cuban, Venezuelan, and Central American Latinos in South Florida, it apparently was socialism. They were refugees from countries that had had bad experience with governments calling themselves socialist, and the Republicans just hammered home in ads all over Florida that the Democrats were socialists and were going to turn the United States into Venezuela. This is completely preposterous, of course, but it apparently worked. And so Joe Biden got radically fewer Hispanic votes in Miami-Dade County, for example, than Hillary did. But elsewhere, for Black men and Latino men, I think it had to do in part with the sense that Trump was stronger and tougher than Biden. His frenetic mass rallies in the final days, while horribly irresponsible and full of a constant stream of lies, nevertheless conveyed an impression of fearlessness, strength, and vigor, while Biden's parking lot rallies with masks appeared by comparison fearful and weak. And that conveyance of the message of strength, I think, had some effect with minority men. This is a very worrisome trend. Oh, with respect to that, let me show you another piece of the exit polling that I thought was interesting. Which candidate quality mattered most? Biden won among people who said, who can unite the country? They split about evenly on cares about people like me. A majority of people thought Trump cared about people like me more. Has good judgment, Biden won overwhelmingly. But is a strong leader? 72% who thought that mattered voted for Trump. So Trump somehow managed to communicate to a significant part of the electorate that he was the strong leader and Biden was the weak one. This reduced vote from minority voters is a very worrisome trend for Democrats. Minority voters, especially Black voters, are the backbone of the Democratic majority. As more minority families move into the middle class, own businesses, join conservative churches, experience less racism, it would not be surprising to me to see the Black vote for Democrats go from the low 90s to the low 80s. And the Latinx vote go from the high 60s to the high 50s. If an openly racist president like Donald Trump is able to make inroads with the minority voters, demographic trends may not be that strong a positive for Democrats if growing minority populations are offset by a growing number of conservative voters among those same minority populations. What happened with the polls? The polls were terrible again this year, even worse than in 2016. In 2016, the national polls were actually pretty accurate. They had Hillary winning by 2 or 3%, which is about what happened. The state polls, though, especially for Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, all showed Hillary winning comfortably, and then she lost them all by razor-thin margins. This year, the national polls overestimated Biden's percentage of the vote by 3 to 4%. They had him winning by 7 or 8%. He's going to win by maybe 4%. The state polls were supposed to be better this year. The pollsters were readjusting their weighting to pick up more non-college educated whites. More polls were being done in the states by more respected polling organizations, et cetera. And yet they were awful. A Washington Post ABC poll had Biden up by 17 in Wisconsin, like 10 days before the election. And the average of all the other quality polls in Wisconsin had him up by 7 or 8%. He actually won by less than 1%, barely won at all. Michigan and Pennsylvania were only a little better. He was supposed to win by 10, 11 points. Instead, he won by 2. Florida polls were off by 4 to 5%. And polls about Senate races were maybe even worse. Susan Collins was supposed to be losing to Sarah Gideon, and she won by over 9%. Lindsey Graham was supposed to be neck and neck with Jamie Harrison and ended up winning by 10%. This led to some major misallocation of resources by the Democrats. They poured over $100 million into the South Carolina race that turned out to be hopeless, and similarly wasted tens of millions of dollars in Maine and even in Kentucky, where people thought Amy McGrath might just pull off an upset and knock off Mitch McConnell. And what's interesting is that these misses in the polls were not restricted to public polling. Donald Trump wants to say, oh, this was liberal pollsters intentionally trying to suppress the vote by showing Biden up and Democrats up by so much. But the private polling of Democratic and Republican campaigns were showing the same thing. Republicans were extremely concerned that they were going to get swamped in a blue wave because of their own internal polling. And internal polling by political parties tends to be biased in favor of those parties. But the Republican polls were showing the same blue wave. The massive the massive misallocation of money in response to misleading polls raises another important point. Democrats had a big money advantage in this election, which is not a normal situation for them. But that money just didn't seem to move the needle very much. It may just be that the power of TV advertising in political campaigns is no longer very decisive. What really worked well were the efforts of people like Stacey Abrams in Georgia during years of grassroots organizing to increase voting among minority voters and others not accustomed to turning out. That's probably where the money should be going in the future. However, I just saw an article this morning that said that Black turnout in Georgia was up by 8%. Voting turnout by non-minority whites was up even more. Now, some of that additional white vote voted for Biden, but the white vote turned out more than the Black vote did in Georgia. But back to the polls. What about the future? It's hard to see anyone taking the polls very seriously in future election cycles, except maybe to spot emerging trends now and then. I'm not sure how they can be fixed. The best polls have been live telephone polls. But one recent study of the Pew poll, which is a highly respected pollster, found that response rates were 36% as recently as 1997. 36% were willing to answer a telephone poll. That declined to just 6% by 2018, and that's probably declined even more since then. With such low response rates, it becomes more and more problematic to claim that those who don't respond to the polls are essentially identical to those who do. Sophisticated weighting techniques don't seem to be adequate to overcome this problem. I don't think Trump voters are lying to pollsters. I do think Trump voters are highly suspicious of experts, media, and pollsters, and are much less likely to respond to polls at all. Hard to know how to adjust for this over time. And it may be very different with a different conservative candidate too. So I think pollsters are really moving in the direction of just trying to make educated guesses. And their guesses are becoming less and less educated as the response rate to polls continues to plummet. Next thing I'd like to talk about is What do we do with the 74 million people who apparently voted for Trump? The figures are only showing 73 million right now, but there's still a lot of votes out. Looks like Biden will get over 80 million and Trump will get something like 74 million. Are these opponents or enemies? Joe Biden in his speech said we've got to stop thinking of the other side as enemies and start thinking of them as merely opponents. I have some sympathies for that notion, but many of the Trump voters are enemies. I'm sorry, they are anti-democratic, authoritarian people who are a major threat to American democracy. The Proud Boys and white nationalists are enemies. Mitch McConnell is an enemy. And at least 2/3 of the Republicans in the Senate are enemies who will do everything they can to thwart democratic processes and obstruct a Biden presidency. Sean Hannity is an enemy. Tucker Carlson is an enemy. Laura Ingraham is an enemy. Fox News is an enemy. About 2/3 of white evangelical Christians who care only about abortion and the religious freedom to discriminate against LGBT people are enemies. At least 4 and maybe 5 members of the Supreme Court are enemies. And so somehow those enemies need to be fought and they need to be defeated and they need to be thought of as enemies and not as in any way potential partners or allies. At the same time, much of Republican support comes from people who believe things like keeping the economy open is more important than fighting the coronavirus. If both the virus and the economy can be handled well, some of those voters are winnable. And if those voters are winnable, their elected representatives become more winnable as well. So it's wrong to think of all 74 million Trump voters as enemies, but I think it's correct to think of about 2/3 of them as enemies. What can be done to open the hearts and minds of those Trump supporters who may be winnable? I think the most important thing is a coherent, consistent, sincere, and massive program to revive rural economies. Democrats should be strongly pushing to get universal broadband across rural areas. They should be pushing hard on rural employment initiatives, how to revive the economies of small towns and rural areas, support for family farms, and measures to address the economic insecurity of both the white and the black working class. Universal health care, expanded rural medical resources, employment security, control over work schedules, subsidized daycare, more junior colleges and four-year colleges in rural areas. There should be a massive program supported by Democrats to bring the successes of our economy to rural areas and small towns. The voters in those areas are not wrong to feel that their interests have been neglected, that they have been left out of whatever advances have occurred because of globalization, that they've been left out of the economic growth of the last 30 years. I think it's also, and this is hard for me because I support all these things, I think the Democrats need to go easy on being too aggressive on cultural issues. I don't know quite how to do this, but I think Democrats have to think creatively about how to make advanced cultural demands sort of local option, strong on university campuses and liberal urban areas, somehow less aggressively applied in small towns and rural areas. Fewer court-determined universal rights and more state and local legislation to give cultural conservatives more time to adjust to rapidly changing cultural rules of the game. So what about the future with Biden as president? Much obviously depends on the two runoff elections in Georgia for the final 2 Senate seats. That's going to be held on January 5th. If the Democrats win both, then they have 50 senators and Vice President Kamala Harris can break ties. I think that's improbable, since both Democratic candidates had fewer votes than their Republican opponents, and Republican turnout in special elections is usually much stronger than Democratic turnout. Democrats turn out better when there are congressional races, a presidential race. Otherwise, they have low propensity voters more than Republicans do. The Democratic Party has built Democratic turnout spectacularly in recent years, especially in Georgia, with Stacey Abrams being the big hero. The question is, will the Georgia voters who gave the state to Biden decide they want to make it possible for him to advance his agenda? Or did they vote for Biden just to get rid of Trump without that much sympathy for his policy agenda? Will they then be inclined to vote for Republican senators to check Biden and prevent an activist Democratic agenda from being carried out? It's going to be very interesting because both parties are going to concentrate all of their resources on that election for the next, whatever it is, 50 days. And I think it's a very unpredictable outcome, because a lot of people who would normally not vote in a special election, I think will vote in that one. But it's going to be true on both sides. In some ways, this election reminds me of 2004. In 2004, when Kerry was running against Bush the younger, the Democrats did a tremendous job in increasing Democratic turnout. Unfortunately, the Republicans did an even better job of increasing Republican turnout, and Kerry narrowly lost. I think something like that happened this year outside of the presidential race. Democrats did a tremendous job of mobilizing Democratic voters, but Republicans did as good a job, maybe a better job, of mobilizing Republican voters. Trump looks like he's going to get 11 million more votes this election than he did in 2016. That's a lot of votes. Assuming that Republicans retain the Senate, I see no reason why the Republican leadership will want to work with Biden. They were highly successful running against the Democrats in both the Senate and the House. Why change direction now? Moreover, they are still terrified that Donald Trump can end their political careers if they cross him. I think it's very likely that Trump will eventually say, I have exhausted every resource and have to give way to Joe Biden, but that is only because the Democrats stole the election. And I am announcing right now that I will be a candidate for president in 2024 and will fight to keep the Democrats from opening our borders or implementing any of their radical socialist agenda. If he does that, if he announces that he's going to run for president in 2024, whether or not he really intends to, that will have the effect of freezing the potential campaigns of any other Republican who wants to run in 2024. Mike Pence, Tom Cotton, Nikki Haley, Ted Cruz, Ben Sasse, etc. Because to announce a run against Donald Trump for 2024, if Trump says he's going to run, is probably political suicide. That will also make Republicans in the Congress reluctant to cross Trump and work with Biden. Biden can do a lot with executive orders, but there's a lot that can't be done that way too. And it's a very complex area of what can and can't be done and what the political impact of that would be. Moreover, Republicans feel strongly that excessive use of executive orders is unconstitutional, at least when Democratic presidents do it. and will challenge Biden's executive orders in court at every opportunity. With a Supreme Court with a 6-3 conservative majority and hundreds of radically conservative, newly minted Republican judges seated all through federal district courts and federal appellate courts, Biden may face as much obstructionism from a Republican-dominated judiciary as from the Republican-dominated Senate. And we may be looking at episodes like in the early years of the New Deal, when the Congress passed legislation, not just executive orders, but legislation that the Supreme Court then declared unconstitutional. And that happened until Roosevelt threatened to pack the court, and although he didn't succeed in doing that, the conservative majority on the court sort of backed off, declaring all his stuff unconstitutional. But I think it's very possible you're going to see district courts, appellate courts, and the Supreme Court rule Biden executive orders unconstitutional whenever they have a sliver of a rationale for doing so. So to conclude, going back to the title of my speech, is America still a democracy? Well, we have apparently removed an authoritarian president via a democratic election, and that's a big deal. But I would say we now have about half a democracy for several reasons. Number one, we have a two-party dominant system, and one of the two parties is no longer committed to democracy, but is willing to use any available anti-democratic tool to preserve its power. I believe American democracy has been saved by a thread, or rather two threads. The 2018 Democratic victory to regain control of the House of Representatives, which prevented Trump having a rubber stamp Congress that would allow him to do anything he wanted, and this current election, which will remove Trump himself from office. But there is something very tenuous about a two-party democracy in which one of the two parties no longer believes in democracy. Two, there is a good chance that Biden's presidency will be a failure as a result of Republican obstructionism, and that failure will lead to a Republican takeover of the House in 2022 and a Republican president, even possibly Trump himself, in 2024. If that occurs, it is hard to see how America retains the core features of our democracy. Three, the lie about the stolen election, which is Trump's version of Hitler's stab in the back lie that helped popularize Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 20s. That lie about the stolen election will be used by Republicans to engage in even more radical forms of voter suppression, gerrymandering, and anti-democratic manipulation of the electoral laws of the states that they control, which include Pennsylvania and Georgia, by the way. Look for Republicans to try to outlaw early voting and mail-in voting and any other perfectly legitimate mechanism that happens to give Democrats an advantage. Look for more obstacles to voter registration, more partisan purging of voter rolls, more unfair distribution of voting sites in Democratic areas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fourth, our political system is already heavily tilted in favor of Republican voters in rural areas. The Senate is radically tilted in that way. The Electoral College is tilted that way. Gerrymandering of the House and state legislatures has accentuated that tilt in favor of rural Republican voters. Republicans now control both houses of the state legislatures of 20 states, while Democrats control only 5 states in that way. Combined with the unwillingness of Republican-dominated courts and a Republican-dominated Supreme Court to provide any check on anti-democratic legislation at the state level, this anti-democratic tilt is almost worse before it gets better. So my final word is American democracy has managed to preserve itself in a much diminished state and by the skin of its teeth over the last 2 years. But American democracy is hanging by a thread, and the Republicans seem to have most of the national supply of scissors. Happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Jeff. My question is, for a long time now, America has been living in two news ecosystems, and it's very hard to come together as a nation when people are living with two different sets of facts. And this is illustrated no more poignantly than by the coronavirus. So what can we do, or should it be a priority to balance our news a little bit so that people can be receiving more factual information?
I have no clue what to do about that. I don't think social media is going to get better. One thing that can happen is that progressive voices can be more active about spreading objective reality through social media and pushing back against anti-democratic frauds and lies. But I don't think you can put the social media genie back in the bottle. I think Fox News, which has done some things that angered Trump lately, is going to continue to support Republican anti-democratic policies. And an interesting thing is even more radical right-wing media is springing up. Newsmax, which is pushing hard the lie that the election was stolen, was getting about 25,000 viewers a day. The other day, they got 1 million. 1 million. And One America News Network, which is a crazy right-wing thing, is also growing in circulation. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's a very serious thing, and it's going to sound very elitist. But it used to be that uneducated, not very well-informed, not very active, ordinary people got what information they got from authoritative elite sources. When I was a kid, you had ABC, CBS, and NBC. That was it. And you had your local newspaper, which was not crazy, right? And so people who didn't have much information took their cues from those elite opinion leaders. Well, there are no elite opinion leaders anymore, and social media has given uneducated, poorly informed people the illusion that they have access to real information that shows the lies of the liberal elite and the liberal media. And they're never going to go back to paying any attention to professional journalists, to scientific experts, to academic experts, to public intellectuals. And so, you know, I don't think it's up to liberals to expand their information sources so that we spend more time reading fake news from the cesspool. It's up to people who are allowing themselves to be dominated by nonsense to start exposing themselves to reality. And I don't know that there's anything that people on the left can do to encourage them to do that. I think that's one of the serious problems that we have going forward. This lie about the stolen election is going to reverberate in that echo chamber of right-wing crazies and just get worse and worse. I know that's pessimistic, but I don't see any easy way to break the stranglehold of lying, manipulative, anti-democratic media on 30 to 40% of the population.
Okay, Jeff, I think you hit on it here about Trump being macho. When you were talking about Hispanic voters, you know, when he had his TV show, I saw him as a bully. But I think that his cult now is turned into the cult of the biggest badass in the room. And he's playing that role right now in the post-election, saying, okay, who's going to stand up to me and tell me I lost? And of course, with his 70 million followers, well, nobody. And how does this end? And what does it carry over into a Biden administration? It just looks like it's just really crazy. Nobody wants to have those 70 million gun-toting people mad at him or her. And so is there any way to break the cult of the badass that is controlling America right now?
Well, I think at the presidential level, we sort of did. I mean, I think that's why women turned against Trump. I think it's why suburban voters turned against him. I mean, not by massive amounts, but there was a big shift there. I don't think that played very well with older voters, although Trump won a majority of senior citizens this time.
Yep.
The polls all showed that he was going to lose by 7, 8, 9%. He didn't. He won senior citizens again. All senior citizens, including minority senior citizens. So that's discouraging. I mean, the only thing that we can hope for is that badassism goes out of style. And I think the cultural trend over the last 20 or 30 years has been that people are less accepting of badass behavior. But in Trump's base, that's a virtue.
Yeah, it's true.
You know, I think there are lots of people who don't even care what policies Trump is pursuing. They like the badass attitude, and they like to go cheerlead it at these rallies. I mean, these rallies are really terrifying to see the things that people will cheer for. And I reluctantly have the feeling that there's a resurgence of respect for the badass, and especially among many male voters who feel like for too many years we've been asked to soften ourselves and become more feminine and touch our feelings and learn how to cry and be nice to people. And damn, it's nice to see somebody telling us to be men again. And I mean, this is nuts to me. But people want a certain segment of the male population, and unfortunately, it's millions and millions of people. They don't want Alan Alda; they want Donald Trump.
I'm just curious about Trump. Looks like he's looking down the barrel of a lot of legal problems over the next few months, especially. And I'm thinking about his tax returns and what that's going to show, which we kind of know or suspect anyway. And I just kind of wonder if that's not going to keep him otherwise. Mentioned it in a comment, to keep him otherwise occupied. I'm hoping for a blindfold and a wall, but I don't think I'm going to get that. So.
Well, Trump is used to living his whole life under the gun of legal problems. He has been more litigious and had more lawsuits directed against him than any other businessman in the history of the universe. So I'm not sure it will bother him that much, although I do think he's scared of them. The discussion now is he going to pardon himself? Is he going to pardon his family? Or is he going to somehow resign and at the last minute and have Pence pardon him? I think if he tries to pardon himself, that the courts will say that's unconstitutional. I don't think even this conservative Supreme Court wants to set the precedent that presidents can do whatever they want, and then at the end of, and you can't prosecute them because they're president, and then at the end of their term, they get to pardon themselves. I mean, the implications of that are just hideous. Do they want that power to be in the hands of Joe Biden? Do rabid conservatives who think he's a monster want him to have? So I don't think that's going to happen, but he probably will pardon everybody else. And he might arrange to have Pence pardon him, which would be constitutional. I worry that some Democrats will push for Joe Biden, and Joe Biden himself may be inclined to pardon Trump the way Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, saying this is part of treating the other side as opponents and not enemies. We can't have this poison polarization going on. And so I'm pardoning Trump, and I'm urging state prosecutors to, let all these prosecutions and investigations drop. I think that would be terrible. I think Trump should be prosecuted for obstruction of justice from the Mueller report. I think he should be prosecuted for every federal crime of which he is guilty, every state crime, and he should be in jail. And he should be exposed as the criminal charlatan that he is. And that might have an effect on those 74 million people. On the other hand, it could backfire and just make him a martyr. And the Trump supporters say, not only did the Democrats steal the election, but now they have put our hero behind bars on trumped up charges. But I believe firmly, I think there was some sense to pardoning Nixon, although I wasn't a fan of that at the time. I think there is no justification whatsoever for slowing down on the prosecution of Trump. This guy needs to be completely discredited and put behind bars.
Hank Robb had a short question in chat that I'll read. He asks, what makes you convinced that Republicans don't stand up to Trump because they're afraid of him rather than they agree with him?
I don't think any sane person, and I do believe that the Republicans in the Congress are sane, I don't think any sane person believes that there was any significant fraud in the election or that there's any chance whatever of overturning the results of the election. That's why I say I don't think this is delusion. I think this is a conscious strategy. I think a lot of Republicans in the Congress are less committed to the strategy, but they aren't interested in standing up to it either. I mean, it's really discouraging to see that they don't have the guts to do that. But it could very well end their political careers to stand up and make noise about it. But they aren't stupid. I mean, it's obvious. And that's why it's so deeply cynical and anti-democratic. When they know the truth, that the election was not stolen, that it was a decisive victory by Joe Biden, that there's no evidence of fraud, and yet they're continuing to lend support to that narrative. And the blatancy of the lies, the presidential press secretary yesterday, McEnany, came on and said there were more than 1 million people at the Million MAGA March in DC, when the real number was clearly something like 20,000 people or less. And objective reality doesn't matter to them anymore. They've learned that if you just repeat the lie over and over, as Goebbels and Hitler taught us, lots and lots of people will believe it. There's a good new series on public television on Masterpiece Theater called Roadkill. Have any of you seen this, starring Hugh Laurie as this sleazy British politician who's working his way up in conservative politics and fighting off personal and political scandals every day? And in the second episode of this, at one point, he turns to his chief of staff, who's bothering about, but what's going to happen if they find this out? And he says, haven't you learned anything? Don't you realize that we can get away with anything if we just brazen it out? And that's what Trump has learned. And that's what the Republicans have learned, that they can be shameless, that the public will not hold them account for being brazenly dishonest and obstructionist. They haven't paid a price. Mitch McConnell was worried about losing control of the Senate. Looks like he didn't.
Our next question is from Dave DiNucci.
I'll try to make it quick. it seems to me that any politician, and Trump has learned this well, they will find a certain number of things that they can really attract someone with, and the rest of it can be attributed to cognitive dissonance. That is, someone won't want to believe those things because if they did, they would disagree with their support in these other ways. So, for example, yes, I agree completely about this badassism and, you know, the strength that he shows relative to Biden or whatever, being too thoughtful or whatever. But I kind of wonder if that isn't what affects people's perception of how he handles COVID. I mean, maybe they can't believe that he's handling COVID badly because if they did, they couldn't have their mind supporting him on this other stuff. So I just wonder what you might think about that.
And he tells us every day that he's doing a great job on handling the coronavirus. Yeah. Right? No, yeah, I think cognitive dissonance has a lot to, I mean, when you look at the figures, and you could put up others, it's just clear that his response to coronavirus has been disastrous. And yet 51% of the population said we're doing somewhat well or very well. I have thought for years, I've been talking at the Humanists going back to the Romney election in 2012 and before, that I always believed that the American electorate responds slowly, that they would eventually catch up to the Republican Party and react to the just systematic dishonesty of the Republican Party. But the Republican Party has doubled down on its dishonesty, and the public has still not reacted against it. Instead, they have, and I think this is the cognitive dissonance, they've said, my heroes couldn't possibly be lying to me all the time. So the people who say that Trump has committed 23,000 lies since he was inaugurated, they must be the liars. Because my president couldn't possibly be telling the same lie over and over and over again, even after being corrected, unless those corrections are in fact the partisan lying. And so Trump has become, and the Republicans have become completely immune to fact checking, because all fact checking is received by people inside the cult as just further evidence of how much liberals lie.
I see what you're saying when you say that if not for the coronavirus, Trump would have won, and I think that may be true. But what does that say about all the grassroots organizing that so many of us did with the Indivisible organization, with Vote Forward sending 17 million letters to voters throughout the country, with Sister District and other organizations that have worked hard for 4 years to get him out of there? Were we just wasting our time?
No, I think without all of that, he might have won. Anyway, despite the coronavirus, despite the collapse of the economy, I think if Democrats hadn't mobilized so hard, Biden might have only gotten a 4 million vote margin, and he might have lost Georgia and Wisconsin and Arizona and Nevada, and Trump would be president. So no, I don't think it was pointless or vain. This election would have been even worse for Democrats if that kind of grassroots organizing hadn't taken place.
You made me feel better.
Good. That's one. I don't think I've made anybody else feel better today.
Maybe not.
So I want to return to a fact that it seemed that you put forward, and that is you were talking about women and how they were voting. But it seemed to me from your graphic that white women in this recent election voted for Trump at the rate of 55%. Now, in the last election, they voted for him 52%. So it doesn't seem, Biden making inroads with women does not seem to be correct. He may be making inroads with non-white women, but Trump may be losing with non-white women. Biden may be making inroads with non-white women, but with white women, Trump is not only holding his own, he's being even more persuasive.
Yeah, I accept your data. I don't have the 2016 data in front of me, but here is the graphic showing 55% of white women voting for Trump. Overall, he lost women by 12%. And I think that's a bigger gap than last time. Sometimes these exit polls can also be off as well. So they have to be taken a little bit with a grain of salt. But the narrative before the election was that there was a gender gap of 20, 23, 25. One even had it at 27%. And that clearly didn't materialize. And I think especially, the suburban women have traditionally been sort of moderate Republicans. And my sense is that there were a lot of suburban women who voted for Biden, but then voted for local Republican candidates. But you're right, here, 55% of white women voting for Trump. I mean, the number of people that Trump despises and has insulted who voted for him is truly extraordinary. And it gives a sense of how deep a hold he has managed to get on the American public, and especially the white American republic, the white American public, not republic, but public. And that's scary. And maybe when he's not president, it won't be as strong. But if he declares that he's going to be a candidate in 2024, and in pursuit of that, once a month, he holds a big outdoor rally like he's been having, that thousands of people go to and cheer and gets a lot of media attention. It may be that he will continue to have a very strong influence on tens of millions of Americans. And if the Biden presidency goes bad, I can imagine, if he's not in jail, him running again in 2024 and winning.
That is a scary thought. We have another question from Gretchen.
Hello. Hi there. Yeah, I have a couple of questions. I was listening to Chris Hayes, and he was mentioning something about, in effect, the Republican Senate planting time bombs for Biden. And he was talking about particularly appointing a gold bug to be the head of the Fed, which of course could be catastrophe in our economics. And it's something they wouldn't do for themselves, but they would do, and because McConnell is controlling the Senate, it would be a little parasite that Biden would be unable to get rid of. And it would all, of course, be blamed on him, the catastrophes. That's one question. Another one is on pardons. I mean, assuming that that Trump even could get away with pardoning himself at the federal level. You mentioned something about states, what the governors, the attorney general, something having the power to pardon at the state level, which would mean where I was hoping that he would be catching him to throw him in the pokey for state problems like taxes, that the governors or whoever there might be able to pardon him at the state level. So I'm concerned about that. Isn't there also some consideration that if pardons are for self-serving purposes, that they can be invalidated? So those are my questions.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve nominee, whose name I forget, but she's a real crackpot. She believes we ought to go back to the gold standard. She's got very screwy ideas about the powers of the Federal Reserve. She's a crackpot. And Trump has nominated a number of crackpots to the Federal Reserve, and they've been slapped down by Republicans in the Senate who said, you know, this is too far. We want the Fed to remain professional, but they're about to confirm this one. And so she's going to be on the Federal Reserve Board, and she's just a wacko. And it gives you some sense that the Republicans in the Senate, Lisa Murkowski just announced yesterday or the day before that she was going to support this nominee because she is up for re-election pretty soon. Susan Collins doesn't have to face re-election for 6 years, but Lisa Murkowski says, yeah, I'm going to vote for this woman. Well, I don't think it takes much courage to stand up to Trump about a wacko candidate for the Federal Reserve. The 70 million people with guns aren't going to come after you for that one. And yet there's Lisa Murkowski saying, yeah, we're gonna do that. And so the Republicans in the Senate and even worse than sometimes in the House really have wandered off into fantasy land. The things that they believe in and the strategies they're willing to embrace are just mind-boggling. As for pardons, yeah, Trump faces a bunch of investigations by the Manhattan district attorney, who is the namesake of his father, who was Secretary of State under Jimmy Carter, and whose name currently escapes me. And they're looking into tax returns and fraudulent business practices, all kinds of things. The Attorney General of the state of New York also has a series of investigations going. A pardon at the federal level would have no effect on those state and local investigations and prosecutions. I think it is possible that there would be pressure, public pressure put on those investigators if they're developed this sentiment that, oh, as part of our desire to bring the country together, we ought not to prosecute the outgoing president because that sets a terrible precedent for the future where every time somebody leaves office, they get prosecuted. I think that's a phony argument, but I can imagine it arising. As for self-dealing, I think it's obvious that there's no good argument for allowing people to pardon themselves, especially if they're immune to prosecution before they pardon themselves and then pardon themselves. I just can't imagine that even a conservative Supreme Court would go along with that. But there's nothing to stop him from pardoning Jared and Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr. and Eric. And there's nothing to stop him from pardoning Paul Manafort, getting him out of jail, and wiping Michael Flynn's slate clean and everybody else. And I would expect that he's going to give pardons to everybody who stood with him, who went to jail, except for his personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. He's not going to pardon him.
Okay, Jeff, I want to thank you again for your 15th presentation today. I speak for all our members when I say that it's truly a highlight of our year when we get to hear from you, and you're always so insightful, and a balance of a bit of optimism with a healthy dose of pessimism, which I think is accurate for America today. So thank you again. We have an HGP mug on the way to you, so you'll receive that. Thank you very much.